So today I'm concluding the series I began called the Holy Trifecta, using this crazy illustration called the trifecta, which comes from the world of horse racing. And what it is, it's a long odds bet where you accurately guess the first, second, and third place in a race. And of course, like it says, long odds, you make a lot of money doing it. And let me give you the secret as to how to make a small fortune in horse racing. Here's how you do it. You start with a large fortune. It's like the guy who went to the track in his $75,000 Cadillac, came home in a $275,000 Greyhound bus. That's how you do it. So the Holy Trifecta is really in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and it says, now abide these three, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And so week one, we talked about the third place finisher, and that was hope. And that hope was the foundation. It's where you start. It's the basis for life. The scripture calls it the anchor of the soul. And hope deferred makes the heart sick. If we don't have hope, we have nothing. And then last week, that was faith floats. Then last week was faith leaps. And what we talked about was that faith wasn't just a little step into the unknown. Sometimes it was a leap into the unknown, because faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It's all about going into the unknown. And so today, my message, to wrap this up, because the greatest of these is love, and my message is entitled Love Prevails. And so we're going to jump right into this verse here, and we'll find out why it prevails. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 31. It says, but earnestly desire the best gifts, yet I show you a more excellent way. Everybody say, a more excellent way. So most of you know 1 Corinthians 12 is talking about the gifts of the Spirit. Paul talks about what they are and the usage of these gifts, and he talks about some extraordinary things of healings and miracles and tongues and interpretation and prophecy and all these things. And he tells us, he says, earnestly desire these gifts. But then he goes, but, let me show you a more excellent way. And the more excellent way that he's talking about is love. And then it goes into 1 Corinthians 13, which we know as the love chapter, and the only time we ever read it is when we're at a wedding, right? Love is patient, love is kind, and I think there's no way those people are keeping all that stuff. 17 points. But anyway, here's what it tells us. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1. It says, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but do not have love, I become a sounding brass and a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have faith so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. So Paul says, these things are great. They're wonderful. I want you to earnestly desire them. But you know what? If you don't do them in love, then it's of no profit. It's of no value. And not only is it doing nothing, but you are nothing. We are nothing without love. Love is the key. Love is the secret. And he's telling us that this thing called love is what it's all about. So he goes right from the gifts of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians 12, and then spends a whole chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, on love, because it is the more excellent way. Do these things, but do them in this thing called love. And then by the time he gets to verse 8, this is what he says, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 8, he says, love never fails. Say that. Love never fails. Love never fails. And that when we talk about love prevails, I'm talking about the fact that love never fails. And so when we look at love, this love that he's talking about, probably everyone in this room could tell me what the Greek word for that is. What is it? Yeah, you all know that. It's the word agape. And agape is a specific type of love. It is not romantic love. It is not sexual love. It is not culinary love. That means like I love pizza or I love cheesecake. We use love for everything. It's none of those things. Agape love could be best described as unrequited love. Unrequited love is this. I know that word's a little, $1 million, but unrequited love means to love someone without expecting anything back. Now, you might get something back, but it has that expectation that something may not come back. And if we can understand that, then that's important. God so loved the world. Even though the world didn't love him, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. He gave his very best to the world. It was unrequited love. He didn't know if he would get something back from it or not, but yet while you were still sinners, God demonstrated his love for you, and he died on the cross. And so that's what unrequited love is. Sometimes we call it unconditional love. A love that does not have any conditions attached to it. It's selfless. It's sacrificial. It's totally forgiving. And you know what? This kind of love I'm talking about is not easy, is it? Is this easy stuff? No, it's not easy. In fact, dogs are better at it than humans. It's true, you know. A dog is better at forgiving. A dog will unconditionally love. If you don't believe this, here's the little test. You lock your wife and your dog in the trunk and come back an hour later. See which one is happy to see you. Now, don't try this at home. This is for illustration purposes only. When I say try this, I don't mean literally try it. People always take me seriously. I tried that, Pastor Wark. It didn't work very well. She killed me. No, you're still talking, so you're not dead. And so here's what we want to do. Love is the answer. Love prevails. But let's talk about the problem just for a couple of minutes here, because Jesus told us this, what will happen in the last days. This is what he said. He said, in the last days, there will be wars and rumors of wars. There will be earthquakes, famines, and pestilences. How are we doing so far? Check, 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 check. And then he went on and he said, and many will be offended, and they will hate one another, and the love of many will grow cold. Does that sound like I'm describing the world we live in today? Many will be offended, they will hate one another, and the love of many will be growing cold. I look at that passage in Matthew 24, I'm thinking, we're living in this world right now. We are living in this world of hypersensitivity where everybody's offended about everything. Have you noticed that? You go on social media, they're offended. You turn on the news, everybody's offended. There's marches in the streets and everybody's offended. I've told you this before, but you know this is true. That I cannot stand up here on a Sunday morning and talk about anything without offending people. I will talk about love and I will offend people. I will talk about forgiveness and I will offend people. I will talk about grace and I will offend people. Pastor Mark, you don't seem like you're a very good preacher. No, I'm not saying I'm offending everybody, but someone will find something to be offended with. And fortunately, I have a personality disorder and I don't care. I learned it from my pastor. When I was growing up, my pastor had this great big stomach that just hung out like this. And he used to say this is not a beer belly. This is a thick skin from pastoring for 20 years. That stuck in my mind, and I thought, I don't want that thick a skin. But when we look at our world, I mean, we see it all the time. I mean, every time you turn on the television, you can be watching a comedy show and somebody's offended. We all saw it at the Oscars, didn't we? The comedians are all afraid to say anything now. They're wondering if they have a career because every time they do something, somebody gets offended. So Chris Rock cracks a joke and Will Smith, in front of millions of people, goes up and sucker slaps him across the face. And all these guys are going, my career might be over. And I look at the last 2 years of COVID, and you know what I think it successfully did? I think it successfully made everybody cranky. People wake up in the morning with the dial at 9, waiting for it to hit 10. What is wrong with us? Well, that's what's wrong with us. Jesus said this will be the signs of the last time. People offended, people hating each other. The love of many grow cold. So if that's the problem, what's the remedy? Let me show you a more excellent way. And love is the answer because love prevails and love never fails. So I want to tell you a real redemptive story right at the outset here that you're going to love. Homegrown story, really current. So we have this young couple in our church. They're back in our church. They spent 7 years on the mission field in Ukraine. And we supported them in Ukraine, this young couple, 7 years there. They were in a city called Zaporizhia, and they were working. And one of the things that they found, you go into these countries, you kind of find your niche. And they discovered that one of the great needs in Ukraine, in fact, all of Eastern Europe, was what they called graduated orphans. And these are people that grew up in orphans. And you remember the stories when the Iron Curtain came down, there was all these kids in all of those Eastern European countries in orphanages. Well, you know what? At some point, they become adults. And they have lived these lives and grown up in these orphanages and devoid of real love and care and whatever. And so the Harders, which is their name, they found this target group, and they started ministering to these graduated orphans, people who are grown up and now are adults, and were dealing with issues. And they had a hard time. They were a tough group of people because they were often hardened and feeling rejected and dejected. But they loved these people, even though they didn't love them back, and they just cared for these people. And so then what happened after 7 years, of course, they had some real good results, but I'm going to tell you one little story. So after 7 years, they came back, and the next thing that happens is there's a war in Ukraine that we've all been watching on television. And one of he messaged one of the young men. His name was Sasha. He's in his early 20s. And he messaged him, and he said, so how are you doing? Where are you? And I'm going to show you a map where Zaporizhia is. And here's the map. There's eastern Ukraine. There's Kyiv up at the top. There's Zaporizhia there. And Mariupol is over there. We know what's happened there. That city has been completely demolished by the Russians. And so this young guy says, I'm southeast of Zaporizhia, behind Russian lines now. And he says, I'm here hanging out with the Mennonites. There's a Mennonite community there. And he says, Steve says, what are you doing hanging out with the Mennonites? People ask me that question every day, by the way. And so he says, what are you doing hanging around with the Mennonites? He says, I went down here, now I can't get back. And I'm stuck. He says, what do you need? And he says, I need money. So Steve sent him money, and he prayed for me. He said, you trust God, you pray. This guy said he was an atheist. He said he didn't believe in God. And so he was in contact with him and messaging him over this time and sent him this money. And the chances of him getting through those lines are very slim. A young Ukrainian man getting through Russian lines, he's either a spy or a soldier. He's going to get killed. He's going to get whatever. And anyway, he manages to make it into Western Ukraine. And Steve says, well, that's fantastic. And this young guy, atheist, says, I feel like it was a miracle that I got out. And one thing after another, he told him the big long story about how he got out. And he says, it was as if God just gave me one miracle after another, and I don't even believe in him, and he was answering my prayers. And so then Steve said, wouldn't this be a good time to invite Jesus into your heart now that you've seen how he cared for you and got you through this? And via text, this young man, for the first time in his life, after all those years of rejecting, gave his heart to Christ. Love never fails, and love prevails. So here's what I want to do. I want to go through and see how much we can get covered today. I want to go through who we're supposed to love, who the Bible commands us to love, and why. And so I'm calling this segment, Who Do You Love? Give you the thanks to George Thorogood and the Destroyers. And so who do you love? And throw it up on the screen. There's three categories of people. There's your brother, your neighbor, and your enemy that we're commanded to love. And your brother is not necessarily your biological brother and only male. Your brother is someone who loves you back or is supposed to, okay? And then your neighbor is someone who may not love you back. And your enemy is someone who just plain hates you, all right? And so here's the three categories. We're going to start with the first one. Your brother is someone who loves you back. Here's what the scripture says about it. It's 1 John. You know John is the apostle of love, right? And he knows something about this. And he had a brother, so he should know. And so this is what John said. 1 John 4, verse 20, it says, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And so the Bible teaches us this, that loving your brother, the people that are your brothers, your sisters, your mothers, your father, your family, your friends, the people that are supposed to love you back, that's the starting point. That's basic math on this. And that's where we begin. And he says, if you can't even love your brother, don't tell me the love of God is in you. Don't tell me you love God if you can't love one another. This is where we start with loving those that would ostensibly love us back. Now, here's what's sort of peculiar about this, because when you go into Scripture and you read the story of the first two brothers, how did they make out? The first two brothers in Scripture, Cain and Abel, Cain kills his brother. And then you keep reading and you see one story after another. You know, if I was God, I wouldn't have put these stories in the Bible. You know what? It makes his people look bad. Well, that's because they are. How many remember David's kids? David had a bunch of kids. We hear he's a man after God's own heart. You look at these boys, they were a bunch of train wrecks. I mean, Ammon, one of his sons, Ammon, rapes his sister, Tamar. Absalom, in revenge, kills Ammon. That doesn't sound like a family-friendly kind of a scenario. But if any of you have ever grown up with brothers, how many of you have brothers? You know what brothers are like. They wail on each other. I grew up in a family with 2 sisters and 5 brothers. And you know, the fact that we didn't actually kill one another is actually a big surprise. I remember one night I got in a fight with my brother over a pair of scissors. I don't know why we both wanted to use the scissors at the same time, but when the fight was over, the scissors, I stabbed him in the neck like this, out of the back of his neck. The scissors were sticking out of the back of his neck. Do you remember this, Mom? I know when you see your brother with the scissors sticking in his neck like that, it looked like I may have done it on purpose. I didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident. I don't know how the stupid scissors got in the back of his neck. But anyway, it's Mother's Day, so I'm going to tell her this story. And I did not stab him, but when my parents got home and there was scissors sticking out of the back of his neck, it clearly looked like I'd stabbed him in the back of the neck.
You need salvation.
Yeah, I need some help, man. I'm just saying that as easy as it sounds to love people that love you back, it's a challenge, right? And I know because I've met some of your families. I know what I'm talking about. I know how hard they are to love. And so here's how are we going to get through this? And here's how I would put it. The family is the laboratory of love. The family is where, why has God thrust us into these things called families? Why does he put us through this much grief? See, the problem with the family is you see everybody's weaknesses, everybody's failures, everybody's warts. You see, it actually at times brings out the very, very worst in people, does it not? And it's the laboratory of love, and it's that place where we have to learn to love others, because if we cannot love those who love us back, or are supposed to, how are we going to get through life? And I heard one of the worst stories that grieved me so much this past year, and it had to do with this family, and they had got so worked up about COVID and so worked up about the vaccine that when Christmas came around, they decided that nobody could come for Christmas dinner if they were not vaccinated. Now, I'm not trying to reveal anything that may have or may not have happened in your house, but that's what happened in this house. Their son, who already struggled with anxiety issues at 20-some, early 20s is what he was. He already struggled with anxiety issues, and now he discovered he was not invited for Christmas. And so on Christmas Eve, he took his own life. It's a terrible story. And so instead of celebrating together as a family, they were planning a funeral. And of course, they couldn't even go to the funeral because they were restricted to 10 people at the time. I mean, I can't think of a bigger tragedy. I look at that and I think, there had to have been a better way. And as far as I'm concerned, that was not showing your love one to another, right? And it's a challenge loving our family, because our families make mistakes. And like we see all of their faults and all of their weaknesses. And yet it's the laboratory of love. It's that place where we learn to love. And we can get through it, because people in families will put up with more grief than any other human beings in the world. Why? Because at the end of the day, we have this thing called love. A number of years ago, I was at a conference, and Bill Hybels was speaking. I've only seen him in person twice. He was here once in Winnipeg. This one was at a conference in the U.S. And Bill Hybels at the time was the pastor of the biggest and fastest growing church in the world, Willow Creek, or not in the world, but in North America, in Chicago, Illinois. And it was an interesting thing because he did something that night that he had never ever done before, apparently. And he got on stage with his wife and his 2 children. And his 2 children were 32 and 35 years old. They were grown children. And his daughter told this story, which was very revealing. Boy, you want to find out how good of a parent you are? Let your adult kids tell the stories, right? And then you'll find whether you succeeded or not. And they sat on the stage, and she told a story about how she went away to college. And she went to Berkeley in California, and she had rejected her faith and rejected the church and really kind of rejected her family. And she thought she would go to this free love place and free thinking place of Berkeley, and that she would find an authentic community. And as she realized when she was there was nothing authentic about this. And it was as phony and baloney and as shallow as anything. And she began to realize that the world that she was brought up in, a Christian family with pastors and a church, and she looked back and she thought, they were the only people that really, truly loved me. And she said, my father never once said, what am I going to tell the elders about your state? And never once was embarrassed and always left the door open and always was willing for me to come back. And then she said, and I came back and I realized the thing I was looking for my whole life was actually back at home and my family and my church and that kind of authentic love. And I remember there not being a dry eye in that room as people cheered as they saw that love never fails. This family that was broken, this daughter that had wandered away, her parents never stopped loving her unconditionally, not judging, not criticizing, not excommunicating or exiling her. And when she was ready, she came back into the fold and that family was restored. There's a power in the love of the family. And if we can start in this place, I'm telling you, we can absolutely change the world. And it's tough. I remember when my having daughters and being so affectionate to my young daughters. And I remember one day saying to my 6-year-old, and I said, and I was kissing her goodnight, and I said, are you going to still kiss me when you are 14 years old? And she said, of course, Papa, I'll always kiss you. I'll kiss you when I'm 14. And so then when she was about 11, she stopped kissing me goodnight. And I said, you promised you were going to kiss me when you were 14 years old. She says, I'm not 14 yet. That was her excuse. So the first thing is this, who do you love? The first thing is your brother, those that are supposed to or should love you back. Now, here's the second one. The second one is your neighbor, and your neighbor is someone who may not love you back. And we know all about this because Jesus tells the story. And I'm going to read the verse first, and then I'll tell a story. The verse I want to read on this, just to remind you, is from Matthew chapter 5, verse 46. It says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? So he's saying, if you love those who love you, that was the first point I made. That's good. But it doesn't have the reward of even the tax collectors love their own family. And the next step is to love those that may not love you back. And so we have this story where this lawyer comes to Jesus, testing him, and says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he says, well, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your might, all your soul, and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus says, you got it. Bingo. Go and do it. So then he's, time out, wait a minute. And so the guy says to him, second question, who is my neighbor? Right? Because that's the big issue, right? The big question is, who is this person I'm supposed to love as myself? So who exactly is my neighbor? How close do they have to live? Is it the guy next door? Is the guy 3 doors down my neighbor? I gotta know, how far is this circle got to extend? So Jesus tells him the story, you're all familiar with this, the story of the Good Samaritan. And he tells them this story about this man who went down to Jericho and he fell amongst thieves. He was a Jewish man. And he was laid, beaten, and wounded and dying on the street. And a Levite walks by. You remember what a Levite was. And he walks by and he crosses on the other side of the street. And then a priest walks by and he crosses on the other side of the street. And then a Samaritan comes along. Jews didn't even like Samaritans, and the hero in this story is a Samaritan. And he takes a man and he binds him up and he puts him on his animal and he takes him to an inn and he pays for him and he says, whatever it costs to take care of this man, I will pay. Or in other words, he loved this man as himself. So then after he tells the story, he turns to the lawyer and he says, which of these ones was the neighbor? Was it the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan? Trick question. Pretty sure it was the Samaritan in this story. And he says, go and do likewise. So here's what we learn from this story. We learn who your neighbor is. Your neighbor is not everybody in the world. Your neighbor is not necessarily just the person who lives next door to you or down the street. Your neighbor is the person with whom you cross paths, the person that you meet on the road to life. And see, if you have to go around this person, then that's your neighbor. And if you have to engage that person and you have to love that person because you meeting them on the road to life, are you following this? That's who your neighbor is. And they may not love you back, but you're supposed to and you need to love them. So I preached this message on the Good Samaritan a few years ago. I preached this message on Sunday, and then on Monday, I was driving down the highway, and there was and I just say this for details, not to criticize anybody. The license plate was from Saskatchewan, and it was a woman driving the car. Merely clarification. And she had pulled out beside this other car, and she was driving in the left lane, and I was trying to pass. I was driving faster, and I was sitting behind her, and she would not move. And she just sat there. And I'm thinking about this message, and I'm thinking, this moment is like meeting someone on the road of life. Is this person, I would like to go around her on the other side of the road, but I can't. She's in my way. And the whole time I'm thinking, what would I do? What would Jesus do if he wanted to pass her? So I think I could go and bump the back of her bumper, or I could honk, or I could make obscene gestures. And so I just sat there and I kind of waited, and we drove like that for like 10 minutes. I'm not joking. And finally she moves ahead and pulls out of the way. And so I thought, now what do I do? Do I just ignore her? And I thought, no, I need to love my neighbor as myself. So I turned towards her. I know you're going to think this wasn't the right thing to do, but this is right. I turned to her and I smiled my broad smile and went, like, I love you, but what? What? That was what I was saying. She takes one hand off the wheel and flips me the bird. And then in an act of uncommon love, I blew her a kiss. I don't always think things through. I blew her a kiss because I thought, what would Jesus do? Jesus would love his neighbor on the road to life. And so I blew her a kiss like this. She took both hands off the wheel and gave it to me double barrels. Gave me double birdies. And I thought, that didn't work beautifully. But I remember that loving your neighbor is loving someone who may not love you back. So like a week later, I think God was in my face about this, frankly. So a week later, I'm downtown, I'm walking to my car, it's parked. I came out of Winnipeg Square, and there's this inebriated couple fighting, and she's kind of beating the tar out of him. She's yelling at him. They're both drunk. She's just wailing on him. She's just letting him have it. I think it was Amber Heard. I think that's what her name was. And so she's just wailing on this guy, and she's yelling at him and swearing at him. And I'm thinking, I have to walk right by them to get to my car. And I think, all I want to do is cross over on the other side of the street. I mean, wouldn't you? I mean, I don't really want to get involved in this. And then she starts yelling at me. And she said, he stole my money. Call the police. He stole my money. Call the police. So I thought, okay, I'll call the police. So I took up my cell phone and I dialed 911. I was waiting for the police, and I was trying to, if he had been wailing on her, I would have intervened in a second. Understand this. But I'm afraid of women, and you know that. And he was too in this moment, I think. And so she's yelling, he stole my money. Follow the police. So while I'm on the phone, I see her purse lying on the curb. And about 50 feet away, 30 feet away, so I went and grabbed her purse, and I'm bringing it back, and I'm on the phone, and I said, okay, I got the police on the line. What do you want them to do? And she grabs the purse from me and says, give me that back. She swings it at me and says, leave me and my boyfriend alone. And she put her arm around him and walked away. And I said to the police, situation is under control. I thought, this loving people is really hard. And you try your best. It doesn't always work out to your advantage. But the secret to this, I believe the secret to life is to love your neighbor. I think it's one of the greatest success principles ever. What if we just decided, and I've tried, and I don't always succeed at it, because remember, they don't always love you back. They may or they may not respond. But what if we started treating everybody we encountered on the road to life with respect and out of love? What if we started as if we were a salesman? What if you started treating every single one of your customers like you were more interested in helping them than making the sale? What would happen? What would the world start to look at? Would you end up being successful if you were a salesman like that? I know for a fact you would. If you put the needs of the other person ahead of yours, everything would change. What would happen if you were running a business and you decided that you were going to put your customer or your client ahead of yourself? So I need to, running out of time, but I need to tell you this story. So I've seen this in action a few times in a remarkable way. So we went on a ski trip in my famous high mileage van with about 400,000 kilometers on it. Why I drove that thing across the country repeatedly is beyond me, but I did. So we got my whole family in, we got all our skis and all our gear. We're driving across the country to go skiing in the spring. And my transmission blew in Medicine Hat, Alberta. And I thought, we are so hooped. I've lost my vehicle. I'm in Alberta. I have no way of getting home, no way of getting to the ski hill. How am I going to get this fixed? What am I going to do? And so I looked up a transmission shop, managed to limp the thing down there. And he says to me, let me make a call to the wrecker, see if there's a used transmission. He calls, he says, there's a used transmission, it's $300. And I said, well, that doesn't sound too bad. I said, but how much will you charge me? And he knew my whole story by this time. And I said, how much will you charge me? He says, I'd do it for $500. Now, if any of you know anything about transmissions, you cannot get a transmission repaired for $500. It's a 10, 12-hour job. There's no way anybody's going to do it. I said, really? He says, yeah, I'll do it for you for $500. And they said, let me phone the rental company. I got a deal with them, and let me get you a vehicle so you and your family can get going. So the rental vehicle got delivered to the transmission shop. We loaded all our junk in, went on our ski trip, never missed a single thing, never missed a day. And on the way back from the ski trip in the Rockies, we stopped in Medicine Hat to pick up my van. I didn't believe he was going to charge me $500 plus the $300. But there the bill was. You don't even pay sales tax in Alberta. Did you know that? And it's a good place. And so anyway, I paid the bill. And then finally I looked at him and I said, I waited till I paid it to ask him this question. I said, why did you do that for me? I said, this is way too cheap to do a transmission. I said, I know that, you know that. Why did you do that for me? You know what he said to me? He said, I put myself in your shoes, and I thought, what would I want if I was traveling across the country and I got stuck in a city and I had my transmission go? I would want someone to take care of me, and so that's why I did it for you. And I thought to myself, I've heard of that before. I think it's called the golden rule, isn't it? To do unto others as they would do unto you. And all this guy did, and then all over the back of his wall was all these thank you cards from customers that he had. And this guy had a booming business because he put his customers ahead of himself. And even though he was never going to see me again, I'm never going to bring a transmission to Medicine Hat again, he did it anyway because he wanted to treat me the way he wanted to be treated. And he loved me whether he knew I was going to love him or not. Trust me, I loved him. So the first thing is to love your brother. The second thing is to love your neighbor. The last and the final thing is to love your enemy. And see, here's the problem. You know this. If you can't love your brother and your neighbor, you're never going to love your enemy. It's never going to happen. And here's what Jesus says about it. He says, it's Matthew chapter 5, verse 43. He says, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. He said, you've heard you're supposed to love your neighbor. Jesus ramps it up. He kicks it up a whole other level. And he says, it's not good enough just to love your brother and to love those who love you and to love your neighbor. You have to love your enemy. And I'm telling you, and you all know this is true, this is the hardest thing you will ever do in your life, is to love your enemy. But if you will love your enemy, they're not just people that don't love you, they actually hate you. And we all have people in our lives that hate us. And if we will love them, God will do extraordinary things in their lives. Why? Because love never fails. Now, I've preached on this many times, so I'm not going to dig deep in it. I just want to close with one final story. It'll sum this up, it'll sum all the points up. So I have a friend who's a pastor, and he's older like I am, and he has grown kids and married kids. And his daughter, her husband, and they have 2 kids, one day he just up and left her. And he decided he didn't love her anymore, and he decided he didn't want to be with her anymore. And not only did he leave her and leave the kids, he left the province. He just left, and left his kids and whatever. And this went on, month after month, and people started to say, and of course he was mad at her for, I don't know why, I don't know all the details of it, but anyway, he left, and that was that. And so people kept on saying to her, why don't you just get on with your life? Why don't you divorce him, or why don't you remarry him, or remarry someone else? And she just determined in her heart, she said, no, this is the husband, this is the man I married. Even if he doesn't love me now, I still love him, and I'm not giving up on him, and I'm going to trust him. And one night we were over at the pastor's house for dinner, and he pulled out the picture of the husband and his daughter and her husband and the 2 kids, and he said, nobody will believe with us on this, that he would come back in this marriage. No one can believe that. People don't believe this anymore. And Kathy and I were sitting there, and we said, we'll believe you, Theo. We can believe that. And he said, really, you can believe? We said, absolutely. We want you to do that for us. And so the 4 of us held hands, and we prayed for this daughter, and we prayed for this son-in-law, that he would come to his senses like the prodigal son, and he would come back to his family. That was 6 months into this separation. And that was 3 years ago that we prayed. And of course, she's prayed, and she's stood, and she's believed it. And then something happened. All of a sudden, down east, wherever he was, he ended up by chance, it wasn't a chance, he ended up meeting this Christian who invited him to church, and he went to church. And then he invited him to come to his home for lunch. And he did that 6 weeks in a row. And as he listened to the word, and as he was exposed to this Christian family, God did an absolute miracle in his heart. And one night, about a month ago, he phoned his wife, who he's been ignoring for 3.5 years. And he said, I've had a change of heart. Would you take me back? And she said, of course I will. Now we got to work through some things, but of course I will. And he's come back, and they're working it out, and they're together and getting on with it. And I thought, you know what? Only God can do that. Only God can do that. Love never fails. And the parents called me up. They wanted to tell me this story. They were so thrilled because not that many people would believe it. That many people thought that they could be restored, that marriage. But see, nothing is too difficult for God, and love never fails. Let's stand together.